Okay, welcome to my Unit 3 dossier / questions for the chapter or unit. So for task 1, I'm going to be recognizing the will of citizens. So for part A, I'm going to describe 3 different methods of democracy governments can use to recognize the will of the people. So direct democracy allows citizens to participate directly in government decision-making without relying on elected officials, meaning every voter casts a direct vote on specific laws, policies, or constitutional changes using tools like referendums and initiatives to execute the majority will. Representative democracy is a system where citizens elect officials to make laws and govern on their behalf, where candidates run for office representing different political parties and citizens vote for the individual who best reflects their personal values, holding those officials accountable through regular elections. So consensus democracy focuses on making decisions through broad agreement rather than simple majority rule, meaning that instead of a winner-take-all vote, political leaders negotiate and compromise across political lines until an outcome is reached that satisfies as many interest groups as possible. So yeah, representative government is something and democracy is something we're pretty familiar with in Canada. So yeah, it's just something to reflect on. Like that's the setup we have here, and for North America and much of the world is run by representative democracy. And then some older ideas, I feel like I remember looking back at like ancient Greece and things like that, where they would have that literally like every vote counts from people. That's the total, basically raw democracy. So now for part B, I'm going to develop an example of how each system would work in an election. So in a direct democracy election, a provincial government holds a nationwide referendum on whether to switch to a single payer dental plan, sending every single citizen a ballot asking a direct yes or no question so that the majority outcome directly becomes law. In a representative democracy election, a constituency is divided into local ridings where candidates from Conservative, Liberal, and Green Party campaigns and Green Party's campaign, allowing citizens to vote for one candidate so that whoever gets the most votes wins a seat in Parliament to vote on legislation for the community. In a consensus democracy election, council members representing urban, suburban, and rural communities sit down in open negotiation sessions after a municipal election, adjusting tax rates line by line until all representatives agree on the shared budget that balances every region's core priorities. Okay, so for task 2, where I'm going to be disregarding the will of the citizens. So for part A, I'm going to describe 3 ways governments can disregard the will of the people with examples. So indoctrination and propaganda occur when governments use state-controlled media, selective education, and censorship to manipulate public thought and eliminate opposing views, such as in Nazi Germany, where Joseph Goebbels directed the Ministry of Public Enlightenment to control newspapers, radios, and school curricula, so citizens only absorbed state-approved ideology. Okay, and then controlled or rigged elections happens when authoritarian regimes maintain a legal appearance of democracy while using voter intimidation, ballot stuffing, or banning opposition candidates, such as in Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, where voters received ballots containing only one state-approved communist candidate, turning elections into empty rituals of obedience. The use of terror and police states involved secret police forces. So arbitrary arrests and violence to eliminate dissent and instill fear, such as in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, where the secret police spied on citizens, tortured political dissidents, and violently crushed peaceful protest to maintain total political power. So another example I can think of for the kind of one-party system, if you look at actually modern day, because everybody thinks of the old examples, kind of thing, the historic examples, but for one contemporary example, you could look at modern day Belarus, which is run by a dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, who is, he currently runs it, and he's been in there for 20 years. He's been in there for 30 years, I think, since the Soviet Union fell. So there's definitely some fishiness there. And I would also say probably for Vladimir Putin. And then, yeah, secret police that is a very historic thing that's been through Nazi Germany, communism, like all areas of the political spectrum. Once they turn radical, secret police is usually involved. So for part B, I'm going to develop an example of how each system could work to prevent people from getting what they wanted. So an example of indoctrination is when a population overwhelmingly desires environmental protections because industrial pollution contaminates their water, but the government bans private news outlets, shuts down research groups, and forces state media to report that the water is completely pure, effectively destroying public organization before a protest can form. An example of a controlled election occurs when citizens organize to vote out a corrupt mayor, but on election day, the mayor uses local police to block polling stations in opposition neighborhoods, disqualifies rival candidates on fake charges, and alters vote totals to force the public to remain under corrupt leadership. An example of a police state involves workers at a state factory attempting to organize a strike for safer working conditions, prompting the government to send armed plainclothes officers to arrest union leaders overnight, threaten their families, and install surveillance cameras throughout town, forcing employees back to work through fear. That last example is something I'm pretty familiar with, as actually it was my grandpa back in Poland. He participated in a worker strike, and he told me lots and lots and lots about how the secret police would intimidate him and his family and people who were leaders and involved in it. So that's a very real thing for me and my experience. Okay, for task 3, I'm going to be looking at concepts of economic equality. So egalitarianism is the belief that all people are fundamental equals who deserve equal rights, opportunities, and status in society, advocating politically and economically for removing artificial social hierarchies and establishing baseline safety nets so no citizen lives in extreme poverty or faces systematic discrimination. Equality of opportunity argues that every individual should start life with the exact same fair chance to succeed regardless of their background or family wealth, meaning it does not guarantee equal final income, but eliminates legal and social barriers so individual effort, talent, and hard work determine personal success. Equitable distribution of income holds that a nation's wealth should be distributed fairly across the population rather than accumulating among a small elite, which governments achieve through progressive taxation, public services, and social assistance programs to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. All right, for task 4, I'm going to be evaluating the fairest version of equality. So equality of opportunity provides the fairest economic foundation for a free society because strict economic egalitarianism and forced wealth redistribution attempt to mandate equal outcomes, which often suppresses individual initiative and requires heavy government interference. While completely unmanaged markets can lead to extreme inequality, where wealthy families hoard opportunities across generations. Where they hoard opportunities across generations. Equality of opportunity creates a fair middle ground as seen in Canada, where public education and universal healthcare serve as prime examples because when every child receives quality schooling and medical care regardless of their parents' income, everyone enters society from a fair starting line. Once that fair baseline is established, individuals who work harder or take entrepreneurial risks earn higher rewards, which honors individual merit while maintaining fundamental social fairness. Okay, for task 5, I'm going to be looking at economic systems and giving a brief explanation. So a command economy. A command economy is an economic model based on public ownership of property and central planning, closely tied to communist theory, where the government owns all land, factories, and natural resources. Central planners decide what goods are produced, in what quantities, and at what price they are sold, and private profit, competition, and consumer choice are minimized or eliminated entirely. So, a mixed economy. A mixed economy is an economic system that balances private enterprise and free market forces with strategic government intervention and social safety nets, allowing individuals to own private property, start businesses, and earn profits driven by supply and demand, while the government regulates industries to protect workers and the environment, taxes income to fund public services like healthcare, and operates key sectors like public transit. So, a free market economy. A free market economy is an economic system rooted in classical liberalism, private property, and capitalism, operating with minimal government involvement, where prices, wages, and production levels are governed purely by supply, demand, and self-interest in a competitive market. Consumers dictate what businesses produce through purchasing decisions, and government intervention is strictly limited to enforcing contracts and protecting private property. Okay, now on to task 6. So task 6 is going to be regarding historical and contemporary examples of non-liberal government actions. So the first historical example is the internment of Japanese Canadians in 1942. So during World War II, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Canadian federal government used the War Measures Act to forcibly strip approximately 22,000 Japanese Canadians of their homes, businesses, and personal property, relocating them to remote internment camps in the interior of British Columbia. This directly violated fundamental liberal values, including individual rights, private property ownership, due process, and equality under the law, by targeting and imprisoning citizens based solely on their ethnic background without individual trial or evidence of wrongdoing. So now we have a contemporary example, which is the quarantine enforcement and movement restrictions from 2020 to 2021. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, governments around the world implemented lockdowns, mandatory stay-at-home orders, travel bans, and mandatory business closures to curb the spread of the virus. This, while intended to protect public health, directly restricted classical liberal principles such as freedom of movement, individual autonomy, freedom of assembly, and economic freedom by prioritizing collective health and security over individual liberties. For task 7, it's going to be a description of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a constitutional document embedded in the Constitution Act of 1982 that guarantees fundamental rights to all Canadians. So in this, it protects civil liberties, including freedom of speech, religion and assembly, mobility rights, democratic voting rights, legal rights against unreasonable search, and equality rights. While Section 1 specifies that these rights can only be limited by laws that are demonstrably justified in a democratic society. So, the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms is a provincial human rights and freedoms statute passed in Quebec in 1975 that sets out fundamental rights, equality rights, judicial rights, and socioeconomic rights across the province. So this applies to both government actions and private interactions between individuals, such as housing and workplace employment, to ensure protection from discrimination across both public and private sectors. Okay, task 8. So I'm going to examine how governments promote individual rights. So governments promote individual rights by embedding legal protections directly into national constitutions and creating independent judicial systems to enforce them, so that when rights are written into documents like the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, they become supreme legal authority of the land. If a government passes an unfair law that infringes on an individual's rights, such as freedom of expression or protection against illegal search, the individual can challenge the law in court, where independent judges have the legal authority to declare unconstitutional laws invalid, to actively check government overreach. Furthermore, legislation like the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms promote individual rights within daily life, making workplace harassment, housing discrimination, and unjust landlord practices illegal. This sets clear legal boundaries and offers legal aid so that individual citizens have the power to defend their personal freedoms against state power and private entities. All right, moving on to task 9, which is the description of collective rights and emergency legislation. So, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit rights are collective rights constitutionally protected under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982 that belong to Indigenous peoples as distinct cultural groups, including ancestral land rights, treaty rights, traditional hunting and fishing rights, and the right towards self-governance, ensuring their cultural traditions and sovereignty are preserved. Emergencies and security legislation, such as Canada's Emergency Act, are statutes that grant the federal government temporary, extraordinary powers during severe national crises like public welfare emergencies, international conflicts, or security threats. This allows the state to bypass standard legislative procedures and restore order while maintaining strict parliamentary oversight to prevent permanent loss of rights. And finally, on to task 10, I'm going to be examining how governments promote collective rights. So governments promote collective rights by legally recognizing that certain groups require distinct protection to preserve their identity, culture, and historic autonomy within a broader society, which differs from individual rights that belong to every person as an isolated citizen. In Canada, the government promotes Indigenous collective rights through constitutional protections that guarantee traditional land use, self-determination agreements, and treaty obligations, ensuring that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities can maintain their traditional ways of life without forced assimilation. At the same time, governments use emergency and security legislation to protect the collective right to safety for an entire population, meaning that during severe crisis, the government may temporarily limit individual liberties to safeguard society as a whole from immediate harm, demonstrating how collective security is balanced against individual freedom.